Intercepted radio messages obtained by British intelligence firm Shadow Break indicate that troops are refusing to obey Central Command orders to shell Ukrainian towns. They're also heard complaining about running out of supplies of food and fuel, some of the harsh realities of war, it seems. So why has Putin's army stalled, if it has stalled, and how will they regather their strength and push on if that's what they choose to do? Let's turn to a retired British Army officer, Major General Tim Cross, whose specialism, General Cross, was actually in logistics to a great degree. So you understand how important those logistics trains are for an army to keep advancing, for the fuel to keep running, for them to have enough ordnance to keep firing their shells. It's a major challenge.
Yeah, it is indeed. There's an old military maxim that amateurs discuss tactics, professionals discuss logistics. Now, I probably would say that, wouldn't I, being a logistician? But to sustain a major campaign like this is is big business. And there's a lot of suggestions that the Russian logistics have not been working particularly well. I'm not convinced that is as bad as the pictures that people is painting. If we go back to the initial intent of this invasion, it was, I think, to secure the eastern provinces, link up to Crimea, put the capital, Kiev, under pressure, and hopefully the Ukrainians would have come to some sort of negotiating table, and that would have been the end of it. And therefore, they've only used limited combat power up to now. And when military units go into battle to begin with, they take with them about 5 days' worth of immediate logistics: food, fuel, ammunition, spares, medical supplies, and those sorts of things. Obviously, we're now into day 7 of this campaign, day 7, day 8, and those assets will be running short. This big convoy, I'm not convinced, is designed to take Kiev and go in and fight its way through Kiev. That's what we call fighting in built-up areas, Freeview. I think it's there to go round and isolate Kiev, begin to use more combat power. I think there's no doubt the Russian military are going to use now, as they have been doing in the last 24, 48 hours, more artillery, rockets, air assault, and so on. Again, to try to bring Ukraine to the negotiating table, and they're now talking about having a second set of talks. There's no way the Russians will pull out of it, so they're going to have to find some way through it.
Just on the point about logistics, if they do run out of anything, what would be the first thing they run out of? And how helpful would an air bridge into or close to Kiev be?
Well, they'll run out. I mean, fuel is one obvious thing, although they haven't travelled huge distances. But nonetheless, just running armoured vehicles when they're static consumes a fair bit of fuel. Food. The Russian soldiers, I think there's talk of Russian soldiers beginning to go into supermarkets and things and find food. So food. They haven't used an awful lot of ammunition yet, so I don't think they'll be running short of ammunition. So I think primarily it will be fuel. And what the Ukrainians can do, of course, is to attack the soft-skinned vehicles that make up the logistic convoys behind the armoured forces.
I mentioned your expertise in logistics. I read also you were involved in the development of one of our earlier versions of an anti-tank weapon. I was just talking to my guest here in the studio, Annabel Denham, about the semantics of some elements of what the British messaging has been recently. This idea that anti-tank weapons are defensive weapons. I mean, I know you can make that argument, but if you're inside a Russian tank and a British anti-tank weapon comes through your heavy armour, eviscerating everybody inside, it doesn't feel very defensive.
No, that's true. It's in the same way that people talk about low-intensity operations. Well, they're not very low intensity. They're shooting at you. So, of course, you're right. But in terms of from a Ukrainian perspective, then they are not driving heavy armour attacking Russia. They are defending themselves against heavy armour and armoured fighting vehicles and so on. So the anti-tank guided weapons we're seeing used are, in that sense, it is absolutely right to say, defensive weapons. They're not offensive weapons. They don't take territory on their own. They simply defend you against, the heavy armour. And key to that, and you touched on this slightly earlier, if I may just throw into this, the Russians have got lots of stuff, and that convoy represents that. And they're undoubtedly going to start using more of it. They're going to use more combat power, and they're going to have to put more pressure on Ukraine to bring them to the negotiating table. But when we talk about fighting power in the British Army context, the physical component is the stuff. It's the armour, it's the helicopters, the logistics to sustain it, and so on. The conceptual component is how you use that stuff. And thus far, we haven't really seen the Russians utilising their doctrine of how to fight. The third component is a moral component of fighting power. It's about the willingness to die on the battlefield, to fight and win on the battlefield. And whilst the Ukrainians are definitely behind, in inverted commas, the Russian physical stuff, the physical component and the conceptual stuff, there's no doubt that their moral component is much, much stronger. And these rumors we're picking up about Russian soldiers being dissatisfied, running out of food, and all the other things you've been talking about, reflects the reality of that. Whilst the Ukrainians are going to be prepared to fight and die on the streets as they have been doing, and to continue that, maybe for months, if not years to come, I don't think the Russian soldiers are going to be in the same place. It's not new, this. Napoleon talked about moral is physical as 3:1. So this determination to fight is going to be a key factor in the weeks ahead. And I think the Ukrainians have got the edge on that, if they haven't got it on the other two components.
And that may be all true, Tim Cross. It may be that there is a sort of morale deficit on the Russian side, but if all you're required to do is to pull a piece of string or a lever or press a button and fire some heavy artillery into a suburban area, then you can see how that has, to put it mildly, a pretty dampening effect on morale of a civilian population. And it just feels to a lot of people, lay people like myself, I suppose, that the model to some degree, sadly, tragically, is Grozny, is Chechnya. They'll be rearranging the rubble in short order, because to put pressure on the negotiating table, you just kill lots of civilians.
Yeah, well, there's certainly truth in that. I mean, I think I go back to what I said at the beginning. I don't think the Russians wanted initially to cause destruction in the way that you're talking about. I mean, Putin genuinely believes that Ukraine and Belarus are, a part of Russia, that Ukraine is the spiritual heart of Russia. He has a strong view about that. And he talks about Ukraine as being part of Russia. We're saying family. So the idea that they were going to go in and try and destroy these cities in the way that Marshal Zhukov, for example, destroyed all the cities in Germany when he pushed into Berlin in 1945 and so on, that was never, I don't think that was ever on the table to begin with. I think he wanted to do the sort of things we were talking about, put enough pressure on to bring them to the negotiating table. That has failed, and he undoubtedly will now bring to bear more combat power. Artillery, as you say, you can, a long-range artillery can fire from 25, 35, 40 kilometers away. So he can bring artillery to bear, cruise missiles, air operations, rocket attack, and so on, in an attempt to get the Ukrainian people to say to their leadership, enough, we can't take any more of this. But I go back to my moral component piece. From everything we've seen and heard, they're not going to do that. So Putin is going to find himself either having to bring to bear all of his combat power and take these cities and hold them, and then find himself in a counterinsurgency campaign, or he's going to have to pull out. And I can't see him pulling out. So, I think he's going to be stuck. It's rather like Iraq. You talked about I was there actually in the road from Kuwait to Basra, the road of death. It's rather like those situations. He is finding himself biting off more than he can chew. And we don't want to be complacent about this. A lot of people are going to get hurt. And if he wants to win the military campaign, he will win it. But it's not going to be easy for him.
No, we can see that already, can't we? Tim Cross, really good to have you on the show today. Thanks very much.